I promise it's going to be still in a very exciting and interesting presentation. So my name's Beth Meadows. I'm a PhD researcher at Glasgow Caledonian University. I'm in my final few months of PhD funding, so it's a very sort of crunch time for me right now, but I'm really happy to be here and sharing some of the findings from my PhD study, which is called Are You Being Served? Exploring alcohol-free nightlife spaces for LGBTQI plus communities. And just the names of my wonderful supervisory team are on the board there as well. And just a flag from the start, I'm a public health researcher. So I'm a sociologist of public health. So I appreciate I'm maybe a little bit of an outlier in coming at this from a slightly different angle. I'm quite critical of alcoholic nightlife industries because I've got my public health hat on. But hopefully, as will become clear throughout the presentation, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And there is space for like lots of middle ground. And just to flag that my PhD has been funded by Glasgow Caledonian University, and I have no conflict of interest to declare, such as funding from the alcoholic nightlife industries that be quite frowned upon for public health. So a little bit of background. Why bother researching this area of LGBTQI plus communities drinking? Well, we know from a small but growing body of international research that queer communities are more likely to drink at higher volume and frequency and experience more alcohol related problems and have poorer mental health. And that's compared to cisgender heterosexual populations. Combined with this, there's a lack of queer alcohol-free community spaces. There's also the factor of the alcohol industry deliberately targeting queer communities under the guise of social cause marketing of things like Pride, as well as the large role that alcohol plays in the commercial queer scene. But it's important to note that the reason why I use LGBTQI plus communities, so the plural, not the singular, is because we're not a monolith. There's lots of different discrepancies and different lived experiences within this umbrella of what's often called the LGBTQI plus community. But like I said, I think it needs to be more complicated than that. It's communities, there's lots of different experiences, and alcohol-related inequalities are no exception. So within LGBTQI plus communities, bisexual women, adversely racialized groups, and trans and non-binary communities, there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that they're more vulnerable to these alcohol-related harms. So some possible explanations as to why these inequalities exist with relation to alcohol. It's important to look at minority stress theory. So this is the idea that marginalized groups experience more stresses in society, both internalized stressors and external stressors such as discrimination and stigma. And that alcohol may be used as a means to cope with stigma and discrimination. And that might be why we see these added effects for queer communities in relation to alcohol. Like I said before, I like to take an intersectional approach to this. So intra-minority stress theory is something that advanced minority stress theory, and that is also applicable here. So members within LGBTQI plus communities can be perpetuating inequalities upon other less privileged subgroups within this community. And there's also been some barriers identified when accessing support. So when queer people go to drug and alcohol services in the UK, and I'll just flip to one of the reports that speaks about this that's on the board there, they're often faced with additional barriers compared to cisgender heterosexual populations. Now, these three reports are Scotland based, but they're still quite useful, particularly obviously to my research in Scotland. And there's a QR code to the Alcohol Focus Scotland recent report, which did some qualitative study with members of queer communities to assess their views of alcohol industry marketing within queer communities. And as you can see from the title, they were quite cynical towards alcohol marketing and saw it as rainbow washing. So some quite interesting findings there. Another bit of background is around this idea of a potentially changing drinking landscape. Are we seeing some change in drinking trends? There's a little bit of evidence to suggest that there's a decrease in drinking for certain groups, such as young people in Western countries. We've certainly entered an era where there's enhanced visibility for things like temporary alcohol abstinence challenges or TAACs, such as Dry January and Sober October. There's also been a significant rise in the industry of no and low drinks. And And I've just added this after seeing Adam's presentation yesterday, because it is absolutely very true, and it is in some of my chapters. There's a massive decline of the nighttime economy more generally, and I think that could be fitted in this change in drinking landscape as well. Within this, we're seeing a more modern, sober movements emerge, such as online social media communities. There's an example there on the board from Sober Girl Society. And these construct newer ways of doing a sober life that definitely depart from stereotypical AA narratives. There's also been a little bit of research that I've been involved with where we assessed sexual minority women's perceptions on terms like sober curiosity, and there was certainly mixed responses to that terminology. So, it's also really important for me, even with my public health hat on, to explain that I really think it's important that we do have nightlife. And there's a lot of amazing social pleasures, particularly for queer communities, that I would frame as a right to party. So as we know in this group, the queer communities sought refuge in nightlife. I think that was just mentioned in one of the previous presentations. They've often been sites of community building, identity making, places to safely explore sexual connections, and ultimately they're safer spaces, right? So it's important, even or maybe especially in public health, to take seriously these pleasures of that alcohol and nightlife can provide. And I really welcome a paper from Nichols and Hunt just this year that explains that. And ultimately, it links this idea of queer joy and how that is a survival mechanism for a lot of queer communities. So I kind of was led to this question of how can these important social pleasures be maintained whilst removing the barriers and risks that alcohol poses for quite a lot of queer communities, and enter this possible partial solution of alcohol-free nightlife. So for those of you who don't know, alcohol-free nightlife is basically sober clubbing, where alcohol and drugs are removed from the equation, but there's a lot of key elements that remain, such as the dance floor, the space to dance and socialise. I've got a couple of UK-based examples on the board. So I actually went into some alcohol-free nightlife events to do some observational field notes at the start of the study, and pictured at the top there in House of Happiness, which is based in London, and that's run by and for queer communities, and it's a sober day rave. And then Good Clean Fun, which has got an arrow to it as well, that's actually an example that's local to Glasgow and is very, very queer friendly. And there's a couple of other examples on the board as well. Just maybe point out Misery Party, that's based in London but had an event up in Edinburgh, and that's for cutie pop communities, and again is a sober clubbing event. So the research project, I've got 4 research questions that have been guiding me over the past 3 years, and the aims are to critically explore and assess the creation, experience and sustainability of LGBTQIA plus experiences of alcohol-free nightlife, or AFN as I'll start calling it now. And just to sort of say that the research paradigm for this is definitely a critical research paradigm, and I've been very interested in intersectionality and applying that as a theoretical framework, both in the recruitment and analysis of this project. So I'm flying through here because I've not got so much time, but just to briefly touch on my first study, which was, of course, a systematic scope and literature review, because I need to find out what on earth is being said about AFN spaces, who goes to them, what are they about, and what's the social impact on people who use them. Unsurprisingly, there was very little that had been written. Oh, I'm going to go back one. Very little that had been written about alcohol-free nightlife spaces. I just found 9 papers in total. In terms of my method, you can see the protocol and Figshare there, but I don't have time to go through it all today. But my Prisma is, of course, on the screen as well. So yeah, total of 9 papers. And I suppose the headline would be that there's not one way to do alcohol-free nightlife, but conscious clubbing, otherwise known as ecstatic dance, was a kind of key way that was identified in the papers. But there was also some evidence of US college campuses putting on alcohol-free parties to try and target binge drinking on campuses. But ultimately, and unsurprisingly, there was a lot of research gaps identified, including but not limited to LGBTQI plus communities and adversely racialized groups. And yet there was some evidence to suggest that they would benefit more from alcohol-free nightlife. So study 2, which has been my primary data collection, I did focus groups and interviews, qualitative, of course, with different communities, both alcohol-free nightlife professionals and just queer people who are interested in or have experienced alcohol-free nightlife, both drinkers and sober people. I mentioned before around intersectionality, the intersections that I chose to focus on were adverse racialization and working class communities. And you can see that reflected in my demographic data there. there, and I used thematic analysis. I also ran a PPI session to inform the schedules of these interviews and focus groups, and I'm doing a concluding PPI session in a couple of weeks to sense check the recommendations of the research. So onto the juicy bit, the interview findings. I wish I had time to go through all of these findings with you, but unfortunately I don't. So I'm just going to be zooming in on one particular example. Just to say, in the orange, they're the superordinate themes, so like the top level themes, and then in the pink, they're the subordinate themes. But as you can see, I've got quite a variance there that is trying to just assess how these people who run alcohol-free nightlife perceive it and think about it and relate to it. So just to zoom in on one, creating the space, personal, professional projects. So everyone who set up one of these alcohol-free nightlife events had lived experience of sobriety and had definitely experienced gaps in their like lifestyle with regards to becoming sober and then trying to still club. So they basically took agency over that and set up their own event. And this is an example here of Joe. And he said, one of the messages on our merch is queer, sober, proud, because we want to be able to instill that and let people know that we're never going to shy away from saying this is a queer-led event, because as co-founders, our queer identities were so entangled in partying and we didn't want to lose that. So there was some perceptions or misconceptions even that were evident in the literature review of people thinking that when they go sober, their life's going to be boring and they will no longer have access to their queer communities. And while that was actually evidenced in some of the focus groups, obviously Joe here is doing something about that and setting up an event that was by and for queer communities, but that soberness became an identity marker that was also entangled in queerness. So in some way, reconfiguring what we mean by queerness. It doesn't, the party animal stereotype doesn't have to also mean alcoholic. It can also mean alcohol-free and just a different way of doing nightlife, I guess. In terms of the focus group findings, so again, the superordinate themes are on top in the orange and the subordinate are in pink. Lots of interesting findings again. I'd love to be able to go through them all with you, but like I said, I don't have time. So I'm going to be zooming in on the more intersectional analysis, which is in the third column on politics of inclusion, and looking at this idea of overlooked needs. So just to embellish that with a quote here, I would also say maybe with this particular quote, there's a potential for it to be called like a conflicting need. But this is Fraz, who is a queer Muslim and was speaking about some of the barriers with traditional alcoholic nightlife that's queer and white dominated and not really catering to specific community needs. So he's speaking about how while it's all well and good to have really visible displays of queerness outside a club, you know, with lots of flags, etc., that actually creates a barrier for him to access it. And he's sort of making a request for discreetness. So maybe the flags are only visible or the queerness is only visible upon entry into the space, just so that people like him who are queer and Muslim and don't drink and want to access nightlife, whether it's alcoholic or sober, can do that safely. And I thought it was quite interesting in terms of framing like coming out as like a quite a westernized concept in that regard. But like I said, there was actually so much more data that spoke to this intersectional side of things, particularly within queer Muslim communities, because I had quite a few participants who were from those communities. So there's a lot more to say there, but like I said, I've got to carry on. So just to bring it to a discussion on a sort of more of a top level, from the data, we can frame alcohol-free nightlife as a liminal space even, whereby nightlife norms are both disrupted and continued. So there's this modification of the standard alcoholic drinking context going on. Alcohol-free nightlife is also a part of this more modern sober or sober curious set of movements, and it offers a direct alternative to traditional alcoholic socialization. Alcohol-free nightlife creates inclusive spaces for some sober queer folk to reclaim their queer joy. However, inclusivity is not a one-size-fits-all practice, and maybe multiple types of alcohol-free nightlife might be needed to suit different groups in the same way that multiple types of alcoholic nightlife are needed. You know, you might have a cutie pock night or a night that's just for trans communities. This came up today in the previous session, and yeah, it's something that's come up a lot in my research, this idea of exclusivity, but exclusivity as safety. It's a means to curate safety within different sub-communities. And something that I didn't get to sort of speak about, but came up a lot in the interviews and is probably unsurprising, that Alcohol-free nightlife does not make a lot of money because no alcohol is sold, right? So there's a real challenge, especially because these are grassroots organizations, in making it financially sustainable. So balancing that idea of the bottom line of like making a profit or even just breaking even, but also adding this lens of they really cared about inclusivity. They really cared about because they're queer organizations, it makes sense that they did, but they really cared about embedding inclusion practices, things such as offering free tickets or sliding scale tickets for working class participants of the events. But then that also created a tension point with, well, we need to make money to keep going. So quite a challenge there. And I've got lots of recommendations, but just to kind of summarize them more broadly, I would say that alcohol-free nightlife should be valued as a valid nightlife option. It should be made more widely available. It should be better funded, and it should be diversified to meet a range of LGBTQIA plus community needs. So just finally, to conclude, it's all well and good me telling you how I've done this research and what it is, but ultimately, what is the point of it? What kind of impact could it have on public health? Well, it's certainly tackling significant public health inequalities, which is really important, and it offers an evidenced evaluation of one possible partial solution to the problem of alcohol-related harms. As we know in public health, there's not one silver bullet solution to alcohol-related harms. It will take a multitude of approaches, and this could be part of that parcel. More intersectional research is definitely needed in alcohol studies, and I'm happy that this contributes to that in that way. And as much as I'm investigating an at-risk group of LGBTQI plus communities, ultimately these findings around alcohol-free nightlife, I think could be applicable to a population-wide level, certainly in the UK where there's obviously significant alcohol-related harms. So thank you so much for listening. Here's my details if you did want to ask me anything about the research that I didn't get around to today, but I'm also looking to answering any questions later on as well.
Approximately a month after I arrived in Lisbon 4 years ago now, a DIY venue in the outskirts of the city started to host a series of queer raves and parties that until then had been itinerant, escaping from and fighting against the pressure of gentrification. Not long after that, this non-club became the site of the ethnography I conducted for my master's thesis. Approximately a month after I defended my thesis, the collective that ran the space announced its closing. One of the main findings of my research indicates that the social reproduction of the queer EDM scene depends upon its capacity to build a safer space for the blossoming of politically oriented pleasures and caring practices. In this context, I analyzed a series of techniques directed to protect the autonomy of the precarious subjects and collectives that make up this scene against increasing dynamics of exclusion from public and commercial nightlife spaces. Grounded in the idea that the academy does not need to know everything, taken from a discussion on rematriation within curriculum studies, I adopted a methodology based upon Edouard Lisson's concept of opacity. This served both as an analytic tool for explaining the social dynamics and the political strategies of the queer rave, and as a tactic for writing about my experience without exposing, and thus endangering, the social assemblages I was trying in any case to render into accepted academic knowledge. Herein, queerness might be seen as a form of pedagogy with a distinctively ephemeral, furtive nature, quoting José Esteban Muñoz. Queerness is often transmitted covertly. This has everything to do with the fact that leaving too much of a trace has often meant that the queer subject has left herself open for attack. Instead of being clearly available as visible evidence, queerness has instead existed as innuendo, gossip, fleeting moments, and performances that are meant to be interacted with by those within its epistemological sphere, while evaporating at the touch of those who would eliminate queer possibility. And so my queer ray fleetingly came and went into the dark, but I won't dwell in mourning. Instead, this paper will explore some of the ethical contradictions I encountered in my work and the epistemological compromises I had to assume. I will begin by briefly presenting the conceptual framework of queer social reproduction and queer opacity in relation to my research, and then proceed to a discussion on the potentialities and limitations of autoethnographic devices for academic writing on queer rave making. So, following Fisher and Tronto's definition of care as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible, I looked at the queer rave as a site of social reproduction for the community that makes up this subcultural scene. I am aware This reading glosses over the diversity of stances within Marxist feminist social reproduction theory regarding, for example, the production of value and the reproduction of labor power. However, it is worth considering social reproduction theory contributions to an interpretations of Lee Edelman's critique of reproductive futurism that considers queer negativity as a means for pushing forward the non-reproduction of the class relation. As Bruno Montfort puts it, we can conceive of the current processes of disidentification of trans and queer subjects as a negative expression of the crisis of reproduction of the capitalist class relation. In a similar vein, Max and Drucke proposes a queering of social reproduction looking at modes of sociality that involve the collective organization of often feminized labor that goes into care and placemaking, stemming from a web of non-monogamous sexual and social relationships. And he says, there's a particularly queerness to an ontology of social reproduction that draws on encounters with and attachments to strangers to intertwine modes of sex, love, politics, and gender care work that mediate boundaries of public and private. Thus, a queer rave can be seen as a form of community labor aimed to sustain the scene and its members through hedonistic, non-reproductive, care-based organizing of space and time, implicitly shaped by the Marxist feminist lesson about the crucial significance of the labor of love that goes into building and maintaining social relations, communities, and the social fabric in general. Note that this quote is taken off a text written by two organizers of queer DIY raves both in Lisbon and Berlin. So as to opacity. Opposing the binary logics of representation and identity as a colonial tool, Edouard Clisson posited the right to opacity as a strategy to append the veracity for comprehension and hence transparency of Western epistemology. As he writes, the opaque is not the obscure, though it is possible for it to be so and be accepted as such. It is that which cannot be reduced, which is the most perennial guarantee of participation and confluence. A queer opacity would thus subvert the dialectics of visibility and invisibility that mediate the liberal promises of inclusion and equality, reducing the production of difference through objection to a mere matter of legibility. The strategies of queer opacity would be akin to what, again, José Esteban Muñoz terms practices of disidentifications. And I quote, at times, resistance needs to be pronounced and direct. On other occasions, queers of color and other minority subjects need to follow a conformist path if they hope to survive a hostile public sphere. But for some, disidentification is a survival strategy that works within and outside the dominant public sphere simultaneously. In line with the Foucauldian reading of both secrecy and confession as truth producing and enforcing devices in relation to sex, is it possible to identify the closet as the central discursive structure regulating contemporary queer identity. An alternative, opaque reading of the closet might serve the purpose of deessentializing this process of forced identification. Hence, the closet could be read as the opposite of the panopticon, following Anna T. that also says, by being in the closet, individuals are allowed to produce or join a conceptual construction of a non-normative place where space is not physical, relationships are not based on biology, and kinship is chosen instead of forced or unquestionably assigned by bloodlines. However, departing from a metaphoric reading of the closet, Brown has done, this could contribute to an understanding of the deceptive strategies of queer rave making as means to maintain safer spaces alive in the emergence of the visible public sphere and its logics of spatial organization. For instance, the queer rave or the queer club or the queer space is like an urban closet. At least there is no need to come out inside of it. And lastly, to the methodological discussion. So once it is assumed that opacity and disidentification are essential tactics for the survival of the queer rave, any form of textual representation of the experience is to find a compromise between revealing and concealing information in a way that contributes to safeguard the scene and its cultural practices while remaining legible to an academic audience. As you may know, this is not a novel challenge in ethnography, especially regarding queer nightlife, and I'm thinking here, for instance, in Luis Manuel Garcia Mispireta. But positioning myself as a member of the scene, I drew upon autoethnographic and insider methodologies arising from traditions of feminist, decolonial, and queer thought, aiming to subvert the normative regime of rigor, again with José Esteban Muñoz, that governs institutionalized knowledge production. Ellis, Adams, and Buckner provide a useful definition of autoethnography as an approach to research and writing that seeks to describe and systematically analyze personal experience in order to understand cultural experience. In cultural anthropology, Clifford-Geertz's thick description evidence that there is more than meets the eye in fieldwork-based research. However, within the opaque queer technospace, one could argue that almost nothing meets the eye. Surely not the public eye, at least not in a way that might be legible from mere description, as thick as it might be, or that wouldn't risk the very existence of the scene. The dark, damp, and boisterous space leaves no room to think or write profusely, and any kind of audiovisual recording would defeat the ethical purposes of opacity, in addition to being extremely unintelligible. This prompted me to engage with sensory ethnography and other effective and embodied methodologies to try and understand the ways in which the queer rave can disorient the straight lines of visual and textual representation of cultural acts and societal institutions, following here Sarahman. To address this, I produced a series of off-site fieldwork notes, expanded from short insight annotations combining memory and experience, which comprised thin objective accounts of the field, objective, quote unquote, thick interpretive description, and opaque veiled allusion, drawing upon an effective mode of queer representation also tried out by Omar Kasmani, for example. The eye functioned here both as a literary device for auto-theoretical experimentation, which has a queer tradition in authors like Paul Preciado or Mackenzie work, and as a performative, reflexive, and self-deceptive strategy that refuses to proclaim a narcissistic eyewitness authority. The self is thus othered, as much a subject of research as it is a strawman for the cultural experience that I try to analyze. Whatever really happens within the spatio-temporal boundaries of a queer rave, I make myself the only responsible for what I was oriented to do. Writing opacally allows for several levels of decryption, but also criticism. What the ethnographical text says is available for academical examination, but its silences would be interpreted very differently by members of the scene, for whom they would be indices of their own experience, or rather, sites of contention. In this sense, even though my thesis aimed to be academically sound, with the purpose of awarding me a degree, the validation I was most eager to attain was that of my friends, with whom I had extensively debated its contents and shared countless raving nights. And so, in typical Catholic fashion, I want to end with a final confession. From the moment I decided to study an underground cultural scene that gave shelter to a marginalized community, every strategy I deployed could never be enough to protect it. As Eddie Gamboa has put it, if the dark is imagined as a site of refuge, then scholarship, even in good faith, shines a light that banishes the precarious cover already extended to these outlaw intimacies. Conversely, the allure of secrecy can also contribute to the mystification of a series of organizational tactics that were also incapable of prevailing against the hard truth of violence. Faced with police harassment, the rave space in which I conducted my research was unable to survive, and no safety measure or care network could keep it running by itself. Evidently, this also extends to my ethnography, however opaque I was able to make it. And nonetheless, I want to end by arguing that for that same reason, it would be futile to cave into transparency and assimilation, or to retreat into obscurity, relinquishing the struggle for the control of the means of knowledge production. Quoting Gabriel Barran, instead of succumbing to the inherent elitism of populist transparency and thus renouncing theoretical complexity, a more sophisticated counter-strategy may be drawn from Glisson's approach to Western metaphysics of purity, that of acknowledging our inevitable engagement with theory, yet only in order to corrupt and collapse to queer its current forms from within. Thank you very much. I also have my reference here if someone wants to check them, but I'm gonna stop sharing now, and if you want to check them, you can send me an email or a message in the chat, no problem. Thank you.